All right, man, peace. So now, as you can see, we're looking at our boy Charlie Rose. We're about to go into a story taking place in the southern portion of the United States. Once again, about the Caucasians from a certain area down south wanting to maintain some Confederate statues, some memories of the soldiers who fought on the side of the Confederacy. Now you have a lot of so-called blacks down in that area who want those statues removed. Let's see what happens in this story.
More than 150 years after the Civil War, there's a new push across the South to take down Confederate monuments. In at least 5 states, critics say the statues celebrate slavery and secession. Defenders argue the memorials honor Southern heritage. Officials in Austin, Texas, and Louisville, Kentucky have already voted to remove statues. New Orleans is about to do the same. Jan Crawford is in Charlottesville, Virginia, with the fight over a monument to a famous Confederate general.
Now, basically what's going on, honestly, like I've stated in the past, the removal of these statues is really more, and the Caucasians from those areas understand this subconsciously, but they won't say it. It really represents the loss of power, the loss of prestige of the so-called Caucasian, and the fall of his rulership. All right, I've heard other people call it the white supremacy. Look, there's no such thing as so-called white supremacy, because there's no such thing as white. All right, there's no such race as white. Like I've said before, a lot of the provisions that were created by the so-called Caucasian were for self-preservation, because that's normally what a demographic does that's in power. They do their best to maintain their superiority for their progeny, for their offspring. Right now, due to the integration philosophy and the Babylonian system of everybody mixing together, the so-called Caucasian is now starting to lose prominence. All right, so now let's see what happens here. Because at the end of the day, you cannot have statues commemorating a war that is anti-American. And this is what I touched on in the videos that I did about the Confederate flag. All right, these symbols are symbols of secession. They're symbols of sedition.
Jan, good morning.
Good morning, Charlie. So this statue of Robert E. Lee was put up nearly 100 years ago. But here, as in other cities across the South, these Confederate symbols now are at the center of a bitter debate about how we define our past as we move forward as a nation.
They're relics of a painful past, memorials to a war, generals whose names are etched in history. Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee.
We must go! We must go!
But now there are new battlegrounds, from Charlottesville to New Orleans. Confederate monuments have been vandalized, and some cities...
Damn, he was trying to get that Black Lives Matter graffiti off. That wasn't moving for... That Black Lives Matter, they put that in permanent graffiti ink.
Cities have voted to remove them, all part of a public debate over whether these statues memorialize racism.
But symbolism matters.
When you say symbolism matters, that's a symbol of what?
It's a symbol, in my personal opinion, white supremacy.
It's a symbol not only of so-called white supremacy, but it's a symbol of sedition. The U.S. government is supposed to have these things removed. It's not supposed to be up to so-called blacks to petition and march and all this other stuff to have symbols of war removed. That's why the narrator stated that the statue of Robert E. Lee was put up almost 100 years ago. That would never have been allowed during Reconstruction. All right. We're in 2017, almost 100 years ago, would have been probably around 1918 or 1919. That statue was erected. That would have placed it during the presidency of probably Woodrow Wilson. All right. For those of you who don't know, Woodrow Wilson invited the Ku Klux Klan to rally in Washington, D.C. He was from down south. All right. So after the era of Reconstruction, when you go into the so-called Jim Crow, you had presidents like Woodrow Wilson who reinvigorated the Klan and who brought a lot more prominence to and glorification to the Confederacy.
And it's a symbol that we cannot have in the middle of our city.
Woodrow Wilson was also a pawn of the international bankers, and he allowed himself to get tricked into World War I by people like Colonel Edward Mandell House, an international banker and a socialist, who was also one of the proponents of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. I believe it was a document called 14 Points and the creation of what was known then as the League of Nations. It went on to become the United Nations. All right, the first so-called one world government.
Charlottesville City Councilman Wes Bellamy has led the fight to move the town's statue of Robert E. Lee. But opponents, led by attorney Charles Weber, argue the statue symbolizes something else.
These are war memorials that exist for one purpose, to honor the men who fought.
Look at this guy. He's desperate. And you could tell he really off camera. He wants to say, I can't stand these niggers. They're always trying to get their way. How could you have war memorials to honor men who fought against the U.S. government? Right? If the reporter was doing her job, that's what she should be asking him.
It's not to promote a cause of the war. It's not to glorify war. It's to honor the men who fought.
Weber points to a Virginia law, similar to others across the South, that blocks cities and towns from removing war memorials.
I wonder what he would say if certain descendants of the Vietnamese who were living in America decided that they wanted to put up statues of the Viet Cong that fought against American soldiers. And say it's not to promote a cause, it's just to honor the soldiers that fought. We're in America now, so we should be able to do that. All right? I mean, it's so easy to nullify and come against this guy's nonsense.
This statue could never be moved. It has to stay here.
Yes.
Forever.
Yes.
Even though many people find this terribly offensive.
Offensive is the...
Look at this guy. He's breathing hard. He's desperate to hold in. He's just trying to hold in his racism.
Is a way to stop a conversation about the meaning of the statue. All right, it's not a way to start the conversation.
I agree with that. When people say offensive, that's a emotional trigger term. What they should use are terms like sedition, secession, and really what America would call today terroristic representation. Right? Anything that comes against America is classified as terroristic in nature. Right? Why are you building or commemorating soldiers and men who came against the U.S. government? You are a terrorist, according to the Patriot Act.
University of South Carolina professor Thomas Brown studies Confederate symbols.
There are hundreds of these across the landscape of the South. The controversies over removal of monuments are partly over, who's going to decide exactly what that public space is going to endorse?
For years, these fights focused on the Confederate flag, which largely has disappeared from public spaces, a reflection of changing attitudes. Opposition to change runs deep and can turn personal.
I've been told I should be taken behind the watershed.
In Charlottesville, supporters of the statue unearthed crude tweets written by Bellamy as a younger man, and he also was targeted with death threats. But Bellamy feels his fight is justified.
We've seen there's still a lot of issues in regards to race here in this community.
He got that shiny face, three-piece suit wearing. He has some political aspirations. Oh man, that man's face is shining, boy. God damn.
Community, and the only way for us to move forward is to deal with them head on.
Now, while this legal fight continues, city officials here in Charlottesville will review a plan next week with recommendations on where to put this 28-foot statue if it's ever allowed to be moved.
It's supposed to be dynamited. That's what it's supposed to be. If America is sincere about its statements on terrorists.
A problem other cities across the South are likely to have to face. Nora?
Jan, thank you. It's an important story. It's going to spark a lot of debate. Absolutely.
From the flag to statues.
Yes. Changing history.
I don't think that it's really going to spark a lot of debate. I think it's going to spark a lot of upheaval. I think a lot of Caucasians are going to retreat back and they're going to say, you know what? It's very simple. This is not anything to talk about. These are our statues. If you want to move, you're going to have to move them over our dead bodies. Right? You already saw that old man, how he was huffing and puffing just at the thought of having those statues removed. And you could see he looked like he was about early 60s. He grew up in an era where his father probably took him out to get an ice cream cone and he told him, son, you never play with niggers. All right. In a very matter of fact tone, he wasn't angry. He said, son, look, You're white, you separate from the niggers. All right, that's how they were taught. So now what's going on today is a big culture shock to them. And for so-called blacks to have the power to stipulate to have these statues torn down, that is a major culture shock to them. But like I've stated in the past, those statues should never have been allowed to be put up in the first place. They would never have been allowed under the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant or any of the Reconstruction presidents. Now, Andrew Johnson may have allowed it because he had dual allegiances. Even though he was vice president to Abraham Lincoln, he was very, very sympathetic to the Southern cause. And he was heavily against the more so-called radical Republicans. All right. But people like Ulysses S. Grant would never have allowed those statues to get put up. That's how I know that most of these statues were probably put up during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, that pawn. But anyway, that's it on that. Peace.